Looking to learn new watercolor pencil techniques so that you can improve your paintings of animals? In this tutorial, I am taking you through my entire painting process step by step for this red-eyed tree frog piece. I'm explaining how I layer watercolor pencil pigment in order to arrive at a level of realism that I enjoy while maintaining a lightness and a glow that is so particular to watercolor and translucent mediums. In the beginning of this video, I am also sharing must-know information and tips for success that will help you succeed not only with today's piece, but with future watercolor pencil pieces that you may decide to work on. If you'd like my outline sketch, reference photo, and other downloadables that I am making available along with this tutorial, I'm going to be linking to a free and open post over on my Patreon, which is available for everyone to enjoy, where you're going to be able to scroll down and find those attached to the end of the post. All right, with all that said, let's jump in. Here is the great reference photo that we're going to be working with, and I downloaded it from pexels.com, and it was taken by photographer Alejandro Orozco. I almost always use reference photos or things that I have in front of me in real life when I am working on my pieces, but I am never really going for carbon copies of what I am seeing. Yes, I like arriving at a certain level of realism and depth and dimension, but it is very important for me to make decisions along the way and see myself in the piece at the end. I use my reference photos as a source of visual information as they help remind me of things that I would have otherwise forgotten, little details that really help enhance and enrich in the piece. And as I always say, value or tone is number one when it comes to developing a sense of believable depth on a flat two-dimensional surface like a piece of paper or canvas. So value or tone is what I am focusing on as I am choosing my colors for my pieces, and it's what I have top of mind as I am moving forward with the painting process and the layering. And that is a big mistake that a lot of beginners make, is focusing too much on getting the correct color and not getting the correct value. If you get value or tonal relationships right, you can even change colors and still arrive at high levels of realism. But to do this, you must be able to tell between lightest areas, midtones, and darkest darks. So do yourself a favor and observe your reference photos in black and white or grayscale before getting started. Acknowledge the location of the light source in relation with the subject. Acknowledge lightest areas and midtone areas and darkest dark areas. And throughout this entire process, remember that what you are painting is a three-dimensional structure that is being affected by light and shadow. This frog's body is made up of multiple planes, some of which are facing toward the light, some of which are facing away from the light, and others which are somewhere in between. It has different body parts that are overlapping and creating shadows on each other. Even the branch that the frog is on is kind of a cylindrical structure. How is the light affecting that cylinder? This is going to help you so much throughout the layering process and is going to help you arrive at much better results. Before starting, I made sure to plan and choose the colors that I would be bringing in. And I focus more on value or tone more than color correctness because of what I mentioned before. As I am choosing my colors, I make sure to set myself up for success by choosing colors that are going to allow me to create lighter areas, mid-tone areas, and darkest areas all throughout this piece, especially in the focal point, which is the frog itself. I'm going to be swatching out these colors for you on this scrap piece of watercolor paper so that you can see what they look like. And as long as you choose something that is similar and make sure that you're bringing in a variety, especially of greens and browns, and also an orange and a red, so that you're able to develop a nice range of values throughout the frog and also the branch, you're going to do great. My first color is light yellow glaze. I'm going to be using that bright yellow as a type of underpainting throughout the entire frog. The second color is gold, and I'm going to be using that for a bit of a value development in the off-white areas of the frog's body, the belly, under the chin, certain parts of the legs and feet. And I chose gold because there is no light beige or yellow ochre looking color in this set. And then I have the 3 greens that I'm going to be using to develop my green values throughout the frog's body. The first green is May green, that's the lightest one. My second darkest green is permanent green olive, and my darkest green is olive green yellowish. It is very, very important that you have your lightest green, your medium green, and your darkest green. The next 2 colors that I swatched out are my dark cadmium orange and my carmine permanent. Those 2 colors are going to be used in the frog's eyes. And then the browns are going to be used in the tree branch and also to develop darkest values in the off-white parts of the frog's body. The lighter brown is burnt ochre and the darker brown is Van Dyke brown. The purple is what I like referring to as my wild card color that I'm bringing in at the end of this painting process. This is something that I like doing when I'm working with watercolor pencils, and it really helps liven up the piece and create more harmony. Essentially what I do with that wild card color at the end is push final contrast all throughout the piece. And because I'm repeating the same color all throughout the piece in deepest, darkest shadow areas, that helps integrate everything and create greater color harmony. And finally, I'm bringing in black, and this is only going to be used in the frog's eye, in the pupil and around the eyeball. I would highly recommend swatching out your colors and activating them with a paintbrush and a little bit of water so that you can see what they look like activated and not activated. Because oftentimes when you do go over a color with water and a paintbrush, they change a little bit. They can become brighter or darker, and this way you can avoid undesired colors or accidents. I'm making sure to completely rinse out the previous color from my paintbrush bristles before I go in and activate the next. Alright, so starting out with layer number 1, and what we're doing in this part of the process, our objective, is to develop the lightest values and to start developing some midtones as well. Remember, we're working from lights to darks and layering gradually. Whenever the subject and the colors lend themselves, I do go in with a light, bright yellow first so that I can have this as an underpainting, if you will. A color to build on. This color is called light yellow glaze, and I'm going over everything except for maybe the lightest highlight areas. I even go over the eye because the colors that I'm going to be using in the eyeball, which are orange and red, just like green, go very well with the yellow when I build those colors over the yellow. Why? Because yellow and yellow green and green are analogous colors in the color wheel, and so are yellow, yellow orange, and orange. So I can trust that when I layer and start building these colors on each other, I'm going to arrive at beautiful gradual results, and I'm not going to get muddy colors because these colors are analogous in the color wheel. The yellow is going to help me create lighter green values when I start placing green on top, and it's also going to help me create lighter orange values when I place the orange on top. This frog has kind of off-white sections to its body, under its chin, in its belly area, and also in its legs and feet. All of those areas that I'm not going to be developing green values in, I need to develop values in with another color. And I don't really have a beige in this watercolor pencil set. The closest thing to a beige is this gold color. Anything like a yellow ochre color or beige color will do just fine to develop some shadow areas in the off-white parts. And throughout this entire process, I am not pressing down hard at all. I am trying to keep my pencil strokes, or the angle that I am laying down the pigment at, consistent in order to avoid a messy look. So my lightest colors are in throughout the frog. It is time to get started with my actual greens. This is the lightest green that I have chosen for this piece, which is May green. And I start applying this green all throughout the frog's skin, wherever I see greenish hues, avoiding those off-white sections in the belly and in certain parts of the legs and feet, and also under the chin. And you're also going to notice that I leave little sections close to the nostril here and around the eye, and also that little white spot on the frog's back completely free of green. And the reason this is because those are highlight areas or white areas that I see in the reference photo. So I want the paper shining through, maybe very, very lightly covered or completely uncovered in those lightest areas. Just like when we're working with traditional watercolor paint, the paper is going to stand in place for our highlights and is going to help us develop those lighter values. It's by bringing in the bright paper as part of the piece that we're able to arrive at light, glowing results. This is why white color is not necessary when working with traditional watercolors or watercolor pencils. With this first green in, it is now time to switch on over to my second green, and the second darker green that I have chosen is called Permanent Green Olive. And I start applying this green over my previous green only in areas that I'm looking to darken more. I observe that reference photo and notice where I see darker areas, and that is where I am layering on this darker green. And there is no need to be super perfectionistic about this. This can be done quite loosely as long as your value relationships are similar to those in the photo. And what really helps me is bringing to mind the three-dimensional structure of the frog's body. Where are those plane changes happening? Where are there sections that are facing away from the light? Where are there sections where different body parts are overlapping and creating shadows on each other? I'm only layering on this darker green color in areas that I'm looking to darken more, leaving lighter areas free of this color. This is very important because if you completely cover up those lighter green value areas with this darker green, you're going to flatten everything out. We need those lighter value areas if we're looking to create a sense of realism or 3D-ness. The aim here is to develop a wide range of values from very light areas to midtones to darkest dark areas, because that is what's going to lead to 3D-ness, to a believable sense of light and shadow. So in other words, the darker and darker you get with the colors that you're using, the more intentional you want to be about layering those darker colors in only darker shadow areas and leaving lighter areas with more of that paper shining through. All right, so I'm all done layering those initial colors all throughout the green areas of the frog's body, and I'm gonna start by doing my layering in the little tree branch, starting with the lightest brown, which in my case is burnt ochre. I'm just going over the entire tree branch shape, trying to keep the angle of my pencil strokes consistent. And once I'm done covering up the entire shape with this lightest brown, I do more layering with the same color in shadow areas under the frog's body. Right now, I'm not concerning myself with developing wood texture. That will come later. At the moment, I'm just thinking of developing a sense of form in the branch and creating those major value changes. I noticed that there is some mossy green in that reference photo in the branch, so I use my second green, which is Permanent Green Olive, and do some layering here and there with this color. Once the green is in, I switch on over to my darkest brown, which in my case is Van Dyke Brown, and I only layer this darkest brown in darkest shadow areas that I'm looking to create, along the bottom edge of the branch shape as well as under the frog's body. And finally, for this first layering of color, I do go in with my orange, which in my case is dark cadmium orange, and do some layering over this eyeball nearest us. You can see how I don't go over the entire thing. I do leave little sections with just the previous yellow layer shining through. And this is because I want to make sure that I'm able to develop a nice range of orange and red values throughout the eye for a sense of dimension. All right, it's time to do our first activation of pigment using water and a brush. This is a size 6 round brush that I'm going to be using for the majority of my color activation throughout this process. And I just have my container with clean water on hand, as well as my absorbent towel. It's very, very important that you have some sort of absorbent towel or a regular kitchen paper towel on hand for your color activation so that you can stay on top of water control. I constantly blot the tip of my brush onto my absorbent towel to stay on top of water control and to make sure that I'm not bringing out too much water from my container as I'm doing my activation, because you can very easily lose control and start creating a splotchy mess if you're not careful. You only need a small amount of water in your paintbrush to activate watercolor pencil pigment. And as you do your activation, you're going to notice oftentimes that colors look brighter or even darker. They do change a little bit, which is why it's so important to do your color swatching before getting started with the painting process. I have some tips that I definitely want to share with you so that you can succeed with your color activation and not mess up all of the value work that you've done so far. My first tip is to work section by section and always start in your lightest areas and make your way toward your darker areas. Because if you start your activation in your darker areas and you make your way toward your lighter areas, the darker pigment is going to stay in those paintbrush bristles, and as you're gently gliding toward those lighter areas, you're going to pull that darker pigment into the lightest lights, and that darker pigment is going to eat up the lighter color. You're going to get rid of your lighter areas and you're going to flatten everything out. My second tip is to rinse frequently. You're going to notice that as I do this, I work in a section and I rinse my paintbrush bristles, blot, and I get to work in the next section. I activate a new section, I rinse, blot, and work in another section, and so on and so forth, constantly rinsing my paintbrush bristles, so that I can make sure that I'm working with clean bristles so that I'm not pulling pigment into areas that I don't want that pigment in. And I also can make sure that I don't have pigment in my bristles, which can muddy up other colors. And my final tip is to avoid overworking. As you do your activation, you're going to naturally end up with some texture, lines and edges to the shapes that you're activating, maybe even a little bit of splotchiness. My suggestion is to leave things be as much as possible. Avoid going in and trying to get rid of every single little texture that you create, because the more you obsess about fixing little mistakes, the more you're going to end up overworking your paper, which can definitely damage your paper, and you're not going to be able to fix that. Plus, this is just the first layer that we've created. We're going to be adding more pigment on top, and a lot of this is not even going to be that visible at the end. All right, so I'm all done with my first color activation. I allowed everything to dry completely, and it is now time to do our second layering. At this point, our lighter value areas have already been created. And our objective with this layer is to darken darker midtone areas and darkest dark areas. We're only layering on more color in darker midtones and darkest dark areas, leaving the previous layer shining through in lighter midtone areas and lightest light areas. So because the lighter values have already been created, I am now focusing on using the darker colors that I have chosen for each area. So here I'm getting started with my second darker green, which is my permanent green olive. The second layering of color should be quicker than the previous layering because when we're developing those lightest values, we're covering up more area. And as I said before, the darker and darker you get with your colors, the smaller the shapes that you're filling in. So I'm applying more of this green in darker shadow areas that I want to push more, making sure that I'm releasing the pressure as I make my way into lighter areas for a soft transition. Once I have done a little bit more layering with that second green, I switch on over to my darkest green, which for me is olive green yellowish. And with this darkest green on hand, I make sure to only apply more in the very darkest areas that I'm looking to create. Always applying this darkest green over areas that already have that medium previous green in them, and darkening smaller areas within those larger green midtone shapes, continuing to release that pressure as I make my way into lighter areas, which I'm not really ever pressing down very hard at all, but I do make sure to release for gradual transitions. And then it's time to do a little bit more layering in the branch. And for the branch, because I am just bringing in 2 browns, I do start by applying a little bit more of my lighter brown, which is burnt ochre, before switching on over to my darker brown, which is Van Dyke brown. Always starting by intensifying the shadows under the frog's body. At this point, with the second layer, I am thinking more of developing texture throughout this branch. You can see how I'm applying this lighter brown in certain sections in a very irregular, unplanned way, and this is so that I can create abstract, irregular shadow shapes throughout the branch, which is going to help me create that wood texture. Notice how I'm leaving lighter sections with that initial layer shining through, and I'm layering on more brown in a very irregular, loose way, only here and there, as well as all along the bottom of the branch where I'm definitely looking to darken more for more of a cylindrical look. With my light brown in, I switch to my Van Dyke brown, which is the darker brown that I'm bringing in, and you're going to notice that I push only shadow areas under the frog's body, under its little legs and feet and fingers, and I apply more of this darker brown over the lighter brown shapes that I created just a moment ago, using more mark making techniques with this darker brown to help create the illusion of grooves. You can see how, especially along the center of the branch, I use more scribbling techniques to help me start conveying more of that wood texture. I also made sure to darken the lower edge of the branch with the darkest brown again. Here I am quickly going in with my darkest green, which is olive green yellowish, to darken certain areas while simultaneously intensifying the green in the branch here and there. And to finish up the second layering of color, I go ahead and add more orange and red in the eyeball to intensify the color and create more of a rounded look. First, I go in with my orange, which for me is dark cadmium orange, and I do a little bit more layering along the outer edges of the eyeball and here and there where I see some darker values in the reference photo. I leave some sections with that previous layer shining through uncovered. I also do a tiny bit of layering with this orange in the eye opposite to us. And then I switch on over to my red, which for me is Carmine Permanent, and I do more layering with my red in the eyeball, especially along the outer edges and just here and there where I see some darker values in the reference photo. And then it's time to do our second activation of pigment. So I bring out my size 6 round brush once again, my container with clean water, and my absorbent towel. And just like what I did with my first activation, I work section by section, making sure that I'm starting in that lightest area and I make my way toward my darkest area. And I'm not going over everything. I am just going over those sections where I just place more color in my second layer. doing my best to stay away from those lightest areas where I didn't layer any more color in. This will help you not pull more pigment into those lighter value areas and keep those lighter value areas protected. As we continue increasing that tonal range and activating this pigment, we increase the depth and the realism in this piece. Not to mention, we also intensify the saturation of many of these colors as we activate this watercolor pencil pigment. This surprise aspect is one of the characteristics of watercolor pencils, which definitely adds some fun into this process. And there is no right amount of layers to work in when you're working with watercolor pencils. It is totally up to you and the level of realism and style that you enjoy. But I think what is really going to be helpful in order to arrive at light, glowing results that have dimension to them is make sure that you are developing that wide range of values from lights to a wide range of midtones to darkest darks, and make sure that you're bringing in the bright paper as part of the piece. I'm about to activate the pigment in the eyeballs, and for that I want to be super careful. If you want to switch to a smaller brush, you can go ahead and do that, but I make sure to completely remove that brown from my paintbrush bristles. I don't want to get any brown pigment in the eye. I want the reds in the eyes to be very bright and saturated. I go in with a very small amount of water and with lots of control, making sure that I have some lighter looking areas and a nice range of red values. I allowed everything to dry completely, and it is now time to move on to layer number 3. And the objective with this third layer is to push those darkest dark areas. So we're really only using those darkest colors that we have chosen for each area. My objective is to arrive at a level of 3D-ness that I enjoy by the end of this phase. So here I'm going in with my second green, which in my case is permanent green olive, and doing a little bit more layering with this green before switching on over to my darkest green. I'm still not pressing very hard at all, and I'm making sure to release any pressure that I'm exerting as I make my way into lighter value areas to create soft, gradual transitions, leaving the previous layers shining through in lighter value areas that I wish to protect, and only layering on more color in darkest shadow areas. So by this point, you can really see how this entire method entails greater coverage of paper in darker value areas and less coverage of paper in lighter value areas. I finally went in and darkened the nostril hole with this green, and I will be pushing it a little bit more later with my second green. I'll also be going over the opening of the mouth with my darkest green. By starting with my medium green and then applying the darker green on top, I can make sure that I always have that gradual transition or a bridge tone between the lighter greens and the darker greens. I have switched to my darkest green, and I'm doing a little bit more layering here and there, only in darkest areas. There are a couple of little mole-looking structures that are white on the frog's back, and I did some research. Apparently these are glands that some frogs have on their skin, and I haven't developed any values inside of them. That is something that I definitely have to do. I have developed shadows outside of them, but not inside. And so around this point, I switch on over to my gold once again to develop more values in those white areas in the frog's body. They're looking a little bit too flat to me. With my gold, I go in and develop some light values in these white sections, making sure that I'm leaving plenty of that paper shining through, and also some very light values along the outer edges of these mole-looking structures. And then it's finally time to bring in the black to color in the frog's pupil in this eye nearest us, and also develop a bit of a black edge effect around the eyes. Whenever I bring in black into a watercolor pencil piece, I always make sure to leave it until the end, because I know that once I have black pigment on my paper, it is going to be harder for me to activate that color around those black sections. Black can really mute down and gray down vibrant colors, and so you want to make sure to leave that until the end, after the majority of your work is already finished. This will help you keep your vibrant colors intact. Using my darkest brown, this is Van Dyke Brown, I go in and develop some darkest shadow areas in the off-white parts of the frog's body, here and there throughout the legs and feet, and I also reinforce those cast shadows on the tree branch, shadow areas in the lower edge, and I also create more scribbling lines and marks throughout the branch to enhance that wood texture. I also use my medium green to create more marks throughout the branch. This will help me intensify the green mossy effect in the grass and also enhance that texture. And it's time to do my final activation of color with water and my brush. This is once again my size 6 round brush. And I'm bringing out a little bit of water at a time from my container, and I'm really just going over those areas that I just placed more color in. There is no reason to go over everything. You can see how I am jumping around the entire piece, never spending too long in any single area, and embracing the textures and sketchiness that watercolor pencil creates. This helps me avoid an overworked look while also developing an interesting mix of painterly effects with sketchier textures. I'm making sure to keep my colors fresh and vibrant by completely rinsing out my paintbrush bristles as I move from section to section. Be careful when activating the black pupil and those blacks around the eyeball. If you want to use a smaller brush, you can go ahead and do that. You definitely want to avoid bringing in black into the red part of the eye because that will gray down the red and make it less vibrant. In this final part of the process, I am doing a few things. I am observing my piece as a whole and noticing if I have areas that I need to push or darken more. I am noticing if I want a little bit more definition along some of the edges of the different parts of the frog's body. If something is looking a little bit too stark to me, or I need to soften transitions between different value areas, I go ahead and create that bridge transition area. If I need to enhance textures, I go in with mark making techniques. If areas are looking a little bit too flat to me, I go in and develop a greater range of values in that area. In some cases, I might decide to remove a little bit of that color. In those cases, I go in with a clean graphite eraser and simply lift up some of that color to reveal more of that paper underneath. As long as watercolor pencil pigment hasn't been activated, you will be able to remove some of it by going over it with an eraser. At this point, it really is all about coming back to see the piece as a whole and checking to see if the finish is what you want it to be. From my many years helping out beginners progress their skills, I've seen that a huge issue that so many people have is that they focus all of their time and attention in one single area of the piece and leave other areas underdeveloped, and this leads to an unfinished look. It's one thing when artists plan to create more detail and contrast in focal point areas and less detail and less contrast in areas that are secondary or supportive. And it's quite another when you fail to finish the piece because you burnt yourself out because you put all your time and attention in one single area and you got too tired or frustrated and you were not able to finish everything else. It all comes down to the strategy, to doing things intentionally. And it's very important to come back to see the piece as a whole, as it is going to be viewed when you finish. And finally, I also bring in my wildcard color. This is also a technique that I save until the end, after I like the level of realism that I have achieved. My wildcard color that I chose for this one is my blue violet, and I am layering some of this purple in those darkest shadow areas in the frog and also in the tree branch. I also layered some of this purple in the pupil and around the frog's eye. With this, I not only push those darkest darks a little bit more for final contrast, but I also add more color harmony by repeating this darkest shadow color all throughout the piece. Personally, when it comes to this last application of color that I do, I don't activate with water and a brush. I leave it alone. And the reason this is because I like arriving at a balanced result where I'm combining both painterly effects and sketchier effects that this versatile medium allows. I like the way that it looks. However, if you want to get rid of some of that pencil texture, you can definitely go in and activate. Just make sure that you're only activating those areas where you just place more pigment in. Moving on to the last thing that I'm going to be doing to complete this piece, and this part of the process is 100% optional. When it comes to watercolor pencil pieces, if I'm going to be developing a background, I usually paint that with traditional watercolor paint. This is something that I have arrived at after many years of working with this medium. I have ruined many watercolor pencil pieces by trying to paint a background with watercolor pencils. I just find that I end up with too much texture when I usually want soft diffused effects in my background, and it's a lot easier to arrive at those soft painterly effects with traditional watercolor paint. Of course, you can also bring in gouache or other painting mediums if you're looking for a more graphic, flat value in your background. If you will be adding a background to this one, I would recommend going with a darker color so that those lighter greens in the frog can really pop. And I just picked a ready-made gray. This color is called Gray Rose Mist, and it is from White Knight's Granulating Natural Earth set. What I like doing when painting large background areas is I use a large flat brush or a round mop brush. I do pre-wetting all over that area that I'm going to be painting with clean water. And after I have effectively pre-wetted that area and I see that nice even sheen, I go ahead and paint in my color. I was going for a nice variegated look where I have lighter areas and darker areas in my background instead of having one flat value. And I tackled those teeny tiny background sections in between the frog's limbs separately with a smaller brush, and I just painted those very small shapes, wet on dry. But this narrow background section at the bottom, I did go in and pre-wet with clean water and then painted in my gray after having pre-wetted. And with that, we're all done with this watercolor pencil piece. I really hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope that you were able to give this one a go or something similar for yourself. Thank you so very much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy your art practice and see you very, very soon.